Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Everything But the Girl record, Fuse. It would be difficult to name another band or artist with a similar, especially the exact same career trajectory as the duo that is Everything But the Girl, starting out in the 80s as a solid but relatively forgettable jazzy sophistopop act, before taking that sound into the 90s, and then in 1996 with Walking Wounded, as well as 1999's Temperamental, taking that jazzy sophistopop sound and completely changing it around and creating those aforementioned records, two of the most beloved down-tempo albums of all time, before taking a step back from the project as a whole. Despite the fact that both halves of Everything But the Girl remained in the music industry with their own respective projects, Benoit and Tracey Thorn's project that initially made them so well regarded by critics and fans alike remained dormant up until January of this year, 2023, when they released the single Nothing Left to Lose, and suddenly announced that they were going to release their first studio album in an entire 24 years. And 24 years since Temperamental, in 1999, Everything But the Girl have proved with Fuse that they are not done evolving somehow. Fuse takes on a number of genre influences that were never, or at the very least rarely, originally seen in the original run of Everything But the Girl records, and that includes everything from modern-day R&B to house music. Considering the fact that Watt and Thorne could have easily followed up Temperamental with just another straightforward down-tempo album, and likely have gotten immediate critical praise just for putting out another album after such a long period of time, it's nice to see them continue to experiment, and at that experiment successfully. They could have just taken the easy way out, and instead they chose to make something entirely new to please both new fans and old fans. It really is difficult to not appreciate this degree of experimentation and adventurousness in their own sound, but it also certainly helps that the incorporation of these influences is incredibly smooth. Tracks like No One Knows We're Dancing and Run a Red Light beautifully weave together contemporary sounds from the alternative R&B scene with a number of different electronic and dance-based influences. There are even some disco-esque production choices thrown about in here, some new disco kind of sounds, if you will, that are more than pleasant to hear and really add to the overall sonic atmosphere of Fuse. Benoit, who is the primary instrumental composer of Everything But the Girl, has always been one of the more underrated individuals of his kind, the type of person that really kind of stays in the back but contributes a major portion of a sound to a particular project, and it's nice to see his trademark style mixing with a number of new influences in the form of Fuse, while also demonstrating the fact that he can still be an amazing performer and an amazing musician as well as composer under the Everything But the Girl name, as he gets put back into the limelight with this album. Of course, Benoit is only half of a duo. Everything But the Girl has another half, and that is none other than vocalist Tracey Thorn, who has rightfully been recognized for her phenomenal vocal work from everything, including Everything But the Girl's sophistopop, jazzy pop days, to their later, more alternative/experimental electronic-infused work. During the duo's early days, Thorne was basically the best thing about them. Even in their weaker moments, her vocal work was always impeccable, and during their later, more praised work, she was still a massive selling point for Everything But the Girl in general in the overall landscape of down-tempo and down-tempo adjacent music, and that, frankly, has not changed a bit, even if some of their aesthetics have. As she has matured as an artist, Thorne's vocal work has just become deeper and generally more matured and emotional sounding, which is saying quite a lot considering even in her somewhat weaker moments, she's still a very impressive performer. So really, saying that some of her best work is found on this record is pretty bold, but nonetheless, it is absolutely true, with tracks like the album opening Nothing Left to Lose, as well as the album closing Karaoke, being really some of the best performance work that she's delivered to date. And again, saying that is really saying a lot. I mean, really, considering the fact that even some casual fans of Everything But the Girl consider Tracey Thorn to be one of the great voices of general alternative music for an entire generation of experimental or experimental-esque musicians, saying that Fuse has some of the best vocal work that she's ever delivered is something that can potentially be a bit polarizing, but is also something that really takes a lot to say, especially considering some of the best work that she's ever put out in Everything But the Girl and otherwise. But knowing all of that, Fuse in its best moments is some of her best work, unquestionably. Tracey Thorn really is a one-of-a-kind performer with a certain ethereality that not only defines Everything But the Girl as a project, but really defines an amazing career with a voice and presence that has maintained impressionability over the course of several decades. Most musicians can't do that over the course of one decade, and yet, all the same, all of the comparisons that one could make Thorn to Kate Bush, to Elizabeth Fraser, there's nothing really that's proper to compare her to. She really is in her entire ballpark, and while I won't say that she's better or worse than any of her peers or either of the musicians that I just mentioned, I do think it's important to recognize that she's in a bit of a tier entirely her own. She's not really comparable to anyone else, even if there are similar vocalists or vocalists that have taken note of her delivery over the years, simply because few musicians can really maintain the degree of ghost-like presence that she managed to maintain over the course of the 90s, over the course of the 2000s, and into the 2010s, and now 2020s. Now, with that being said, as much praise that I'm giving both Benoit and Tracey Thorn, Fuse is a record with problems in its own right. In fact, many people could understandably consider this record to be somewhat disappointing, as it is fairly flawed. It could certainly be said that a roughly 35-minute long runtime is a bit too short, considering it's been a 24-year-long wait since the last Everything But a Girl record. And, I think that it would have been fair had they felt like they managed to achieve everything that they wanted to, but frankly, even after Fuse wraps up, it still does feel like Benoit and Tracey Thorn have more to say, or at least that they should have more to say, but they just don't. Karaoke wraps up as a fantastic track, mind you, and then that's just it. There doesn't feel like there's any sort of grand closer or majorly important artistic statement that's being said, and although that's not necessarily necessary for any given record by any given project, no matter how long it's been since their last release, it really does feel like Everything But the Girl should be capable of delivering something at least a bit more full feeling or complete feeling, considering the fact that they've done so in the past through this project as well as other projects, and that after such a long wait, there should have been more closure here, even if this doesn't end up being the final Everything But the Girl record. Fuse isn't just success after success either. In fact, there are a couple of tracks that do qualify as misses, and those songs, although not the most atrocious things in the world or anything like that, do certainly drag the record down a slight bit, and ultimately that results in a weaker final product than what I would hope for, especially considering, as I just mentioned, the shorter runtime for the album as a whole. For example, Time and Time Again is a decent and admittedly well-produced track that feels harmless, albeit somewhat uninteresting, that certainly does drag the album down, considering it just simply isn't on the same level as the majority of its peers, especially when considering the fact that it is sandwiched between the very good When You Mess Up as well as the aforementioned No One Knows We're Dancing, two tracks that, although not highlights on the album, demonstrate the better qualities of Everything But the Girl in general. On the other hand, Caution to the Wind is an entirely forgettable deep house cut that is really the only through-and-through disappointing song on the entire record, despite the fact that there are examples of deep house and more generalized house excellency found throughout the rest of Fuse. The style just doesn't seem to land on that song in particular. The lows of Fuse may not be abysmal per se. In fact, the worst tracks and worst moments here are merely just mediocre, but nonetheless, it is impossible to claim that they don't weigh down the album just a little bit, again, especially considering the fact that it is a fairly compact listening experience with not a huge amount of material on it, meaning that the weaker moments do manage to stand out more than they otherwise would in an album with a more extended runtime and a more filled out track list. I will say this. For diehard fans, Fuse may not be some great comeback for Everything But the Girl. In fact, it may actually be quite disappointing for some, with a fairly short runtime, a couple of misses here or there throughout the track list, and a fairly different style from where the project last ended off in 1999. It's pretty understandable and fairly agreeable, I would say, that this album is not going to be for anybody, even if this is something that is technically for older fans, but at the same time, it really isn't. This is the kind of record that isn't necessarily something that can be just applied to older fans because, oh look, this band that I really liked released a new album. I will immediately like it. This isn't true. It's just not something that is true in this case. Sure, there are older projects that can release whatever they want, and it'll probably be valid in terms of enjoyment for the majority of their older fan base, but Everything But the Girl just aren't like that, and Fuse is not a record that will immediately spark with every single older listener who's coming back to them 24 years later. That being said, Benoit and Tracey Thorn were never the types to just pick up with a certain sound after leaving it be for an extended period of time. In fact, I would argue that for anybody more heavily aware of Everything But the Girl, Fuse does exactly what you would expect the duo to do, picking up exactly where they would have already been even if they didn't take a hiatus from working with each other in a musical context. Everything But the Girl is an ever-developing and ever-evolving project, and frankly, I think that this is exactly where they would be today, even if they did consistently release music over the past 24 years. It just so happens that they didn't. And you know what? Despite its flaws, Fuse happens to have a fair number of bursts of excellency throughout it that make it worth a listen both for older fans and newer fans alike. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. That's the end of this album review, and I'll see you guys in the next one.